Great. I'd like to call to order the October 23rd, 2024 school board meeting. Are there any changes, additions? Bless you. Bless you.
Saying nothing, I move that we approve the agenda as presented.
Second. Do we have a motion and a second to approve the agenda as presented? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? So moved. After the governor sent out a letter trying to get everybody prepared for the upcoming budget process. And as a result, a number of, and this is the normal season for us to start discussions, preliminary discussions anyways. So we felt that it would be proactive for us as a board and to help inform the community, you know, as to how the process works. And the School Boards Association, the Vermont Business Managers Association, and the Superintendents Associations, you know, have been in, you know, constant discussion. But both Jacob and Katie were at the combined meeting a couple of weeks ago. No, it wasn't. It was about a week ago. And they brought back some very helpful tools that we'll be able to incorporate in the process. So the first order of business is going to be a presentation from Katie and Jacob. You have the floor.
You don't mind, I'm actually gonna move like this. I tried doing this last time and my neck hurt.
Yeah, that would make a little sense. Are you ready to go, Jacob? Great. So yes, as Coach mentioned, Jacob and I attended a conference a couple of weeks ago. And you can go to the next slide because I'm going to talk about the two entities that hosted it. So it's the VSA, which is the Vermont Superintendents Association, and VASBO, which is the Vermont Association for School Business Officials. And this was a collaborative planning meeting in anticipation of a challenging budget year. So I'm going to tonight just explain what we learned. That really is the purpose of our presentation this evening. And I want to be clear and very explicit that this is not to make recommendations. This is just to say, this is in a room full of superintendents and business officials from across the state. These are some practices that are recommended as we approach particularly this budget season that we are anticipating being challenging. So disclaimer of, you know, this is merely providing information, and I don't personally purport to be an expert on all of these topics, but this information was really helpful to learn more about. So just wanted to be clear in our intentions. The purpose of the conference and the collaboration between the VSA and VASBO was really to think about, give us an opportunity, Jacob and I, which I was really grateful for, because our relationship in this context and capacity is new this year as interim superintendent and finance director. So part of the purpose of the conference was to provide business officials across the state an opportunity to be with their superintendents and sharing some learning together, which was very beneficial for both of us. Also to provide us with some background that's going to help us to better understand the climate of budgeting this year and some things that we need to consider as we enter into the budget season. One of the elements that we're gonna emphasize tonight that was really compelling and helpful and interesting to learn more about were the various budget frameworks that districts across the state utilize in order to approach the budget in a scientific and data-based way. So we're gonna be sharing some of those models with you tonight that we learned about while we were at this conference. And we also learned more about the ways in which you keep the community informed about the process as you move through it. And when you look for input and how you share, the different phases of budgetary planning, and, include the community in decision-making. And then, finally, it's always an opportunity to collaborate with other colleagues and learn from districts across the state, which we really, again, benefited from a good deal. So some of the guiding questions at the conference, as I mentioned previously, were, how do you make these sound financial decisions all the time, but particularly during challenging times? And thinking about, instructional best practices as your focus and North Star of developing a budget. And then the second, guiding question and learning targets was, how you communicate to the community about instructional and financial decisions at all times, but particularly during challenging times in your pitching and budget planning. So, quite apropos. So I'm gonna qualify this again and underscore a note that I took a lot of the information in these slides directly from the presenting slides from that conference. So I'm not gonna take any credit for this. Some of these, most of these, in fact, slides come from an individual named Megan Roy, who actually was the superintendent of Washington Central Schools last year, has since moved into a leadership role at St. Michael's College, training school leaders. And she's also on the Commission for the Future of Public Education, working closely with the interim secretary and the others who are on that committee. So many of these slides are hers, and I want to be clear about that because I don't want to take credit for her work. But she gave us some really helpful categories and buckets to look at as we're thinking about the budget. And thinking about cost drivers such as personnel, which, as many of you are aware, is the bulk of any school district's budget. Thinking about special education, facilities, and tuition, and these are all the cost drivers. And then there are delivery models that impact the cost drivers, such as class and school size, and district size and infrastructure. And the purpose being, thinking about how our education dollars are spent and what that impact is on education quality, which impacts outcomes for all of our schools. So some of the different buckets that she gave us in thinking about how to approach the budget was thinking about school configuration, intervention models, and special education service delivery. So when we're talking about school configuration, we're really talking about class size and thinking about optimal instruction, the way in which we organize ourselves in terms of leadership. So principles, the behavior systems and structures we have in place are ways to configure ourselves. The intervention models that we're using and what impact that is having on the quality of education and the outcomes for our students. And then the way in which we're delivering special education services. So here are some of the best practices that were shared with us. And to be concise, she put them into 4 different categories. First, thinking about what the role of the school business official is, which is providing insights, recommendations, and guiding the conversation around cost effectiveness. Also, and Jacob can speak to this, providing accurate and up-to-date accounting so we know what we're working with and we can think about relative costs. We are also talked a lot about sharing and decision-making with our administrative council in this case in Hartford, and how we're thinking about the needs of the district as a whole, This was emphasized a lot throughout the conference, that you really need to think about budgeting and your approach to budgeting as a district by setting. That principals have input into setting staffing levels, which we'll talk about a little bit more throughout this presentation. And that principals are given realistic budget alternatives to really think about impact of cost funding on outcomes. So staffing rules is something we're gonna jump into a bunch, but because there was a huge emphasis on this at the conference. Staffing decisions for classroom teachers, like class size, how we're using our interventionists, how we're using our instructional coaches, and how we're using our supports in general, but that they're set fairly and consistently across the district. So that was really interesting to hear, because again, the emphasis was upon how we look at this district-wide in an equity-based way. So that school and district consistency was something that, you know, was talked about a great deal. Feel free to jump in, Jacob. Okay. So one of the background information that we were provided with is what the latest research indicates about best practice as it relates to class size. So there's a lot that's been written about this. These are some really helpful articles if you're so inclined to dig in about what the research indicates. But on the right-hand side, there are some bullets that relate to what this research talks about, which is basically like, if we're thinking about class size, small on a national landscape ranges from 15 to 20 students, which is well above the smallest class sizes in Vermont. So just thinking about it in a broader context was an interesting way to think about it, because we often look at Vermont or we look at our district, but zooming out is really helpful too. That the research also indicates that positive impacts of smaller class sizes occurs when very large class sizes are reduced. So something like a 40, student class size that's then reduced to a 30 student class size would have impact. But those numbers are not typically the numbers we're working with in Vermont. The research also indicates that investments in class size has less impact than other investments, such as intervention and social emotional learning, and investments that we could make in those areas. But that the number one thing that came out of this is that the quality and skill of the teacher continues to have the largest impact on student performance, which I think makes a lot of sense. But in this context and framing was interesting to hear. So this is what the education quality standards that are going to be effective in July of this year indicate on class size. So they cluster the grades K-3 and then 4-12. And so classes and grades K-3, when taken together, shall average fewer than 20 students per teacher. And grades 4-12, when taken together, will average fewer than 25 students. And the total class roll of a teacher should not exceed 100 students, unless you're thinking about programming that can be expanded, like, music programs or PE, programmatic expanses that actually can still provide high quality education with larger numbers of students. So the qualifier here, and something I'll talk about a little bit later, just to put this into context again, is that when we're talking about what the EQS is saying, they're talking about like fewer than 20 students in K-3. That would be like the maximum, right? So you kind of have like a less than 20. And then what districts across the state do is they think about what the optimal class size looks like, what that range would be, and then what the minimum class size would be. So it's not just saying, okay, every class should have 19 students. It's saying that's kind of the max. And then we as a district need to think about what our optimal is and use research to do that. And then we have to determine what that minimum would be in order to really think about how we're staffing based on what the research indicates about optimal class size, if that makes sense.
Katie, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah,
Do you know what our actual class sizes are?
we've got to do all of that. We just got our October 1 count, so the plan is to look at all of those numbers. Yeah. So our class size policy, I thought it'd be helpful to put our class size policy in here just to, again, provide some context and bring it to our district too. This follows the VSBA model policy, which basically says that like the superintendent in consultation with building principals will develop what those optimal average class sizes are and take those into account in thinking about our instructional needs and our staffing that's related to that. And it indicates that it could vary depending upon the differences among programs, and schools, and this would be connected to school size and programmatic needs. So as most policies are, it allows for some room, but then the district's, job from there is to define the procedures. And so that's what we're thinking about now, that it would be like, what would be the related procedures to this? If this is the policy, what does that look like, in our schools? So here's a collage of the way in which different districts across the state have established what these numbers are. And you can see that they organized them differently. So again, we have that like room. If we were to like move forward with something like this, you could arrange this in a variety of different ways. That most of the, all of the time you see the grades that are impacted on the left-hand side. What the minimal average class size is for the district, what the optimal range is, and then what the maximum is. And the maximum number will always be driven by what the state tells us is that maximum that, that they indicate, and then we determine the rest. So these are some different districts who shared how they do this. And this would be, again, a framework that they use to develop their staffing. So you'll see that, again, it differs based on the grade cluster because the maximum size of class would be lower for 23 than it would be for 12. And these numbers are actually all based on the current EQS, which is different than what's being proposed and will go into effect in July. But you'll also see that there are certain districts that also looked at content area. So that's interesting too, to think about, what that, minimum, optimal, and maximum would look like if you're thinking about a different content area. So that's clearly articulated, down in the, bottom left, as well as the upper right. And the upper right is just focused on 9 through 12. That's a district that is, that has a high school. So they're just focused on the 9-12, and that's why they broke it also down by content area. And you can also see some differences here that are more dependent upon the size of the district. So that's what is meant, by that VSBA model policy that, you're really going to be considering school size when you think about what your minimum, optimal, and maximum class sizes are, because you don't want to set the district up for failure when you're thinking about like, if it's a really small district, for example, and you say minimum class size is 12, you're not gonna be able to run a lot of classes because you're not gonna have the students to populate the minimum, if that makes any sense. So you do have to consider what total school population is, what total district population is to really get a sense for what makes the most sense in terms of minimum, optimal, maximum, was their point. Yeah.
Do we know what the outcomes are for each of these scenarios? Like, were there better outcomes when they broke it out by instructional area versus just grade?
That's a really good question, Garrett. I don't know. One thing that's coming up in the presentation is how many schools think about other layers of this, which is basically like, so what I saw mostly, and I love that question. I actually want to look at that and ask some of the superintendents who arrange their frameworks like this. But one thing that they do account for, which we're going to be talking about next, is how you consider the fact that you could have a class size of 12 students, but if a third of those students are students with disabilities or identified as qualifying for free and reduced lunch, or some other factors, then that actually, you can't really apply that class size number in the same way. So they talk more about how different districts think about how you identify need as it relates to class size, which I also really appreciated and which is coming up next. So there was one district that presented about how they developed their budget framework, which was really interesting. So first of all, and this is why I'm saying that tonight, and I can't emphasize it enough, presenting information, not making recommendations at all, because there are districts that take a year to do this. They take a year to develop what this framework looks like. And it takes a lot of time because they want input from stakeholders in order to make decisions about how we approach a budget district-wide. So what this district did is they started the year, and they worked with a firm too, and this was all year. They worked with a firm, and the firm's recommendation was put out a survey to start this process and to identify what the community values. So one of the questions that was asked was whether you agree that, or would you support that resources be allocated in a way that supports the students who need them the most, even if it means reducing the resources at the schools of the respondents that they're most associated with, right? So what this was indicating is like, do you value equitable allocation of resource, even if it means, you know, the school that you're most closely associated with reduces resources. So this was the data that they got, and what they found was that 72% of all respondents and 79% of their staff strongly agreed that resources should be allocated in that way. So allocated toward the students who need them the most.
What was the population again for the study? Do we know? Was it all of Vermont, or was it just a school?
No, this was just a school, this was Burlington. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the big ones.
Yeah. So this is the model that they came up with at the end of their work with this firm and at the end of the year, which was basically they developed a baseline staffing model, which makes sense, right? Because the majority of our funding goes towards staffing. So it will, you know, the staffing model, which is the darkest area and the largest area of this model, provides each school with its core staffing using ratios of staff to students. So for example, they would use that EQS, you know, number of one counselor for every 250 students, for example. And some of those things that I was talking about before that I'll get to, about the layers of how you identify need. They also had non-personnel funds for supplies and materials that were allocated on a per student basis. So that was basically like looking at the population of a school, allocating a dollar amount to each student that was there. You get that for supplies. And then they had what they call a RISE allocation, which was based on recognizing injustice and seeking equity. And that also used the weighted student formula. So that would mean that there would be more funds in schools with greater student need, in addition to applying that formula to staffing.
They use the weighting formula used by the state, or do they develop their own?
They developed their own. Yep. And we're gonna get to that next, what that looked like. this is what it looked like. So what you would have on the far left, which I took out just to, you know, you could find this online, but for confidentiality, I just took it out. All of the schools in the district would have been on the far left. And then they developed this need index that was based on the percentage of students living in poverty, students with disability, ELL students, so English language learners, BIPOC students, percent BIPOC. But they also used, which I found interesting too, they considered the percent of novice teachers at each site. So they put all of that together to develop what they call the need index. And so this is what would impact the way in which the school was staffed. Because you have to account for, their argument anyway, is you have to account for the fact that different schools are composed of students who have different needs. And so these were the identifying elements and categories that they used to think about what that need index would be. And then that would be applied to what their staffing numbers were and what those like minimum, optimal range and maximum class sizes would look like. So if you had, for example, a kindergarten classroom that, you know, you had an optimal range of like, you know, let's say 13 to 15 students, and that classroom had 14 students, and you were like, okay, that's perfect. But then you applied the need index, and actually that number is more like 20 or 19, then you'd say, we're gonna leave that class where it is, because we're now applying the need factor, and what that ultimately means is that class of 14 is really considered to be on the maximum end of what we consider to be a class size that's based on best practice and research. Does that make sense? Okay. So another model, and there were like a number of models presented to us, but I just wanted to pull one out to talk about it. This was another model that was used that didn't necessarily include as much of the nuance as the other model that I presented to you. But they had their staffing rules as well. What they considered in their staffing rules, and I believe this is Maple Run District, what they considered in their staffing rules was not quite as nuanced as Burlington. They used, correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob, they used, I believe, free and reduced lunch data and student with disabilities data. So they didn't include the BIPOC data, and they didn't include the novice teacher data, and they didn't include the ELL data. So this is like another way that you can look at it. Because then they, you know, they had an allocation that was based on equity measures as well. And again, you see that the bulk of the funding is always going to go to staffing. So the takeaway, I think, for at least for me, and let's see if you agree with this, Jacob. The takeaway for me was that it's helpful to have a framework in place that can help you determine what staffing levels are, because the bulk of funding ends up being spent on staffing, and you want to think about all the factors that go into what makes sense in terms of student need and staffing. Would you add anything else to that?
Exactly right.
Okay. So I think we're at Q&A now, right?
Yeah.
So anything we can't answer, which might be a lot, because again, I'm not pretending to be an expert at all. I just am saying that I went to a conference and learned some information and brought it back to you. But we'll do our best to answer questions tonight, and then if you have some that I don't have an answer to, or Jacob doesn't have an answer to, I have our contact information up here, so you can reach out to us with any questions you might have.
Do we want a staffing model currently?
Yeah.
No.
Not that I'm aware.
And I'll just say, one of the things that was really interesting for me from the conference, was how my fellow business managers, were communicating the budget information to the public. And it's not something I really wanted to talk about, I'd rather show you, because a lot of people are coming up with some very nice graphs and everything. I know everyone loves all my budget numbers and how exciting it is, but I think there's certainly a lot more we could do with graphs and visually presenting the data to the public regarding the budget, so that's something I plan to work on.
Yeah, the infographics were super helpful. Like the one that we showed to all of you, I just found that so helpful to see that all right there, color coded, you know, it was really, really helpful to be able to, you know, decipher it in that way and not have it just be kind of like grayscale, you know. It does matter, and I think that was one of the takeaways in the communication aspect of it was like, there are things you can do to help people to better understand the information you're presenting by just like thinking about access, you know, for all of us. I mean, you know, we're used to working with students and then we forget that adults are also have different needs in terms of learning. So yeah, I agree, Jacob. There was really helpful information related to like the way in which you present information and how helpful or unhelpful it could be depending upon the delivery. So I appreciated that too as an educator.
So one of the issues in the past that's been driving some of this has been issues that didn't even make it into this presentation, where class size would be based in part on the number of students in a given class in the catchment area for the school, which could result in disproportionate levels among schools. And also very low or high, depending on how the breaks were in classes, because if you had 30 students, you either had the option of a very large class or two relatively small classes. And so there's been a lot of sort of give and take and budget around the edges. And some of these issues end up having very significant ramifications in terms of public impact, because families that have moved to a certain portion of our town because of perceived belief that a given school is a better school, or that's where their family went and they want their kids to get there or whatever, become very unhappy if you start saying, well, we need to move children around the district to balance out class size or other factors. So it can get more complicated, and we're gonna have to deal with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I liked was that it was about also thinking about school size in terms of total enrollment, right? So you look at total enrollment and then you break it down.
Right.
And that would mean that that school would get more allocation of resource because of their total enrollment, plus those factors related to need.
Right, and the other,
And one of the other, mitigating circumstances for us is the number of new units of construction that are being added, you know, to our community as we speak. And we don't have a firm number.
Yeah.
You know, we've asked, you know, the developers and purveyors in that area to try, and that's part of the reason we put that in the bond, was so that we could find out accurately what that family disposition is gonna look like. Because right now, it looks like the primary development area is within the White River Elementary catchment. You know, if we left the catchment as it is, the new housings.
and that's as a result of basically state preferences for growth in what the state has identified as growth areas and communities, which tends to force the growth into areas where there is existing infrastructure, additional infrastructure doesn't need to be built out. So that means downtown where it's densely populated and so forth, and in our case, that coincides with some of our schools. but not with others, because they don't elsewhere, the growth is not in a designated area.
And what's fascinating with the modeling, you know, just looking at, you know, the different schools, you take a district like Burlington, you're looking at about 3,000 students.
3,600. 3,600.
36? I thought CBU was up around 35.
That's what the Google machine says.
So that means we have two school districts that are in the 35 range. You know, roughly, you know, just using that as a student population, number. So you start multiplying that out, you know, in these factors and utilizing that, you're looking at, you know, teacher, numbers alone, you know, in the 400 plus, range, of teachers, and that's just, without looking at the influence of Brigham in all of this, is that equity piece that keeps coming up, as far as, how do you determine equal education for every student that walks in the world. And that's just, that was a Supreme Court decision here in Vermont, and, that's a guiding principle. It's front and center.
But I do think the survey results would be different in a more moderate district as our own, as opposed to the progressive district of Burlington.
I was gonna ask, have we ever, to piggyback on that, have we ever polled our district and asked, a similar question, and if not, can we? Or are we planning to?
Well, that's part of the grant, part of the, the bond, was to look at, that as well, and putting in an RFP out. There are at least 3 major organizations in New England that do that for school districts. So we will get, an adequate representation when we put out the RFP for that, determination. Because, we had to, and that was part of the premise, was all of this growth and development that's coming. We need to know how that's going to impact the district.
The other side is obviously different sized communities can go to different degrees, and that's splitting up the money. If you've got very small numbers, you just can't split it as many ways and have any appreciable difference made. 30% of $30 is not a whole lot. Well, 30% of $40,000 is a good bit that gets split up. And depending on the number of schools and classes and students, we have very different constraints on how we can make the analysis, but then when you go through it, it's not going to make a meaningful difference in what actually happens in a given class necessarily.
What's the district's database look like? I mean, are we able to pull numbers easily?
Yeah, we can pull those numbers. Can you remind me of your name, please?
Zach Scott.
Thank you.
It's not public comment, huh?
You want it in or not, sir?
Give me a
So that's just.
Thank you.
How difficult would it be to come up with class size numbers actual by our next meeting? Is that reasonable? I mean, I would just like
Yeah,
to know, knowing what you've showed us.
Yeah.
How good or how bad are we, or do we fall in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I put a request out just to gather some data. I'm not sure what the timeline will be. I think that's a fairly reasonable request if we're just looking at those numbers and not asking for everything that, there are, the models indicated, but
I have other questions that that go right along with all of this. One is in our budget, and I'm sure Jake can tell us. But out of the total costs of running the district, how many dollars are spent on what I refer to as medical needs? Students who have to have psychologists or support staff or whatever with them in their classroom. How many are there? What's the cost for them? Versus one of the other interesting things would be to know this district is spending on feeding children. Because I don't think the public really understands that it's almost like we're raising our own children. We feed them, we try to educate them, we try to do the best we can with their health needs. And that's all money. And I'll stand up and say thank you for coming, because I wish we had as many people here tonight as we've had the last few board meetings. They want to know where their tax dollars are going. We'd like to show them and what's going to happen in the coming year. Because Kevin, how many million is it the legislature took out of the educational fund last year? And at this point, I don't think it still has
It was in the 30 range.
how much?
It was in the 30 million. They borrowed from the ed fund.
And so we're already faced with, as they try to put the state budget together, we're already faced with that downfall. And so I'm going to go on record here and say, I did my budgets different. It's like a fishbowl. I hand it to you, tell you what our limitations are, and you and your managers come back and tell us how you put the puzzle back together. But I would like to see two budgets, personally, for myself. My colleagues here can vote me down, but I'd like to see one at 0% increase. Literally. And as I said, the fishbowl is yours. If you want to see a 3% increase for the staff, by all means allocate it. But when you do that, obviously, that amount of money's gotta come from somewhere, because it's not gonna creep up on the top line. So I would like to give you the chance to bring one in at 3%. And where does that bring us? Because then it gives us where we can have discussion. I may not see my zero. I may not see 3% either, but at least we can look at the people sitting there in those chairs and sit and say, we did do justice. We did look, we had discussions. And to the best that we can do, this is what we're going to suggest. Because this budget year, it's gonna be painful. It really is, and I can't believe that we do not have other people here. It's the same with the union. The union, all I've heard since I've sat on this board is they want to participate, they want to participate, they want to participate in the decisions, and from their feeling, that's never happened. Well, I'd like to say, ladies and gentlemen, here we are, it's a new ballgame, belly up to the bar, help us. Tell us how we can come up with a 0 budget. Tell us how we can come out with a 3% and have everybody comfortable and happy and know that we're not pushing up the class sizes in the rooms and we're not putting burdens on teachers. It's a balancing act.
Just for clarifications, I like your idea, but I might suggest one additional cut.
Yeah.
A 0 base budget, i.e. dollars don't change at all from year to year. A 0 based per pupil budget. And then the 3% budget just to have as a comparison. Because if our number of students continues to go up as we project.
Right.
The impact on the funding per student is going to be potentially significant. I have no idea what that is. I don't know what the impact of all of the buildings that we are told are being built is going to actually be in terms of number of students. I've seen very widely varying estimates, but based on what we think is going to happen, based on the information we get, having a flat budget in terms of dollars, a flat budget in terms of spending per student, and then for comparison purposes, it may well be that the spending per pupil budget is higher than 3%, or it could be lower. We don't know because we don't really have that worked out yet, but I'd be interested if we're going to do the cuts that different way, that gives us more insight.
Well, one of the things that happens, and this is, just, our educational funding system and being that per pupil cost is the fluctuating, number, in the equation right now that we get. It's all backfed into the system with the state. So we've had years where we've suggested that you work towards a 3.5% increase. And what would happen is you would work to that number. And then in January, we find out that based on those numbers that we got and now adjusted, we either are in better shape than we thought or in worse shape. One of the things that's happened to us, fortunately, is because of, we are one of the few districts in the state that are continually growing. And even though you hear on the news, the population is decreasing and all of that, we're fortunate and unfortunate at the same time, because leveraging, that change is really tricky. Because the services that you need to provide for that Doug's talking about, those individual costs, and it's just the need. I mean, you saw it in the presentation from, VASBO and the rest of the state. That's what happens. And there are so many factors that end up being pushed upon us in February and then again in May that can really flip those numbers, right? Right over. And then even though we have to have our budgets done by January. So, that's.
Can I get some
Go ahead.
clarity on that funding? Maybe that's what's coming next, I don't know, but.
Yes, but.
You get your numbers in January to the state, or the state says, this is what you've reported, this is your number. How often are you receiving payments from the state and when for the following?
So going in through January up to when we go, we're making a lot of assumptions. And we're I always like to frame every budget as this is a snapshot in time based on the information that we now have. So obviously, we'll get like the equalized pupil number, which will affect the budget. We'll get the CLA, which will tremendously affect the budget, and then we'll get the yield information. Last year, it was a record. I think we had 8 or 9 different sets of yields that we were working on, each of which was like, oh, it's going up, things are looking good. Oh, no, it's down this week, things are looking bad. We're gonna have to cut more. So we're gonna do whatever we're gonna do, but ultimately, like, until the state finalizes the yields, like, we're.
I guess to clarify my question, are you getting monthly payments from the state? Or are you getting one payment based on your October 1st population of the school year?
No, that number has nothing to do with this year's funds. See, the October sets next year's.
Okay, that was my question.
That's, so we're on that calendar. Everything that
Right.
we have coming has already been allocated.
So that's my question.
Two kinds of pots, sort of.
This year's money is based on last year's numbers.
Yes.
Right.
And it doesn't adjust.
There's kind of two pots of money, so we have like the big one, which is like kind of like the local taxes, and we have kind of like the state funds, and those are getting down over prepayments throughout the year.
And we also have some federal funds, but I don't know how that flows into it.
Monthly?
Monthly, okay, so different pots have different rates.
I mean, to play the devil's advocate, I don't know why we're stopping at inflation percentage. I don't know. Maybe some people would want to spend more money than what inflation is at. So, 0.5% of the last year.
Well, it's happened, we've had years.
But you're asking for budget proposals and varying amounts and distributions, and I'm saying, why is it 3.5% is the top number? Why aren't we getting one for 6%? Why isn't the Sutton getting a magic wand to say, hey, create your best school district? What do you need?
I guess that would kind of be my question, maybe we ought to put out a survey about this, but like, what are you as the public willing to accept and support?
Oh, I'm just playing the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I know.
Give me possession, I'll take the opposite.
So part of the problem is, even though there's demonstrably little relationship between how much we spend in a given year and what happens to the taxes, because we have had years in which we have had a decrease in per pupil spending and the taxes have gone up, and vice versa. Because of the way the different effects of the common level of appraisal and other things flow through the yield number and all flow through the state. We are generally trying to aim our budgets towards what we think the community will be willing to accept. And that has been as much a matter of crystal balls and it's very hard to tell.
When was the last time the budget didn't pass on its first vote?
It's been, what,
10 years.
10 years? Yeah,
At least.
maybe a little bit longer. We are very fortunate that this is a community that tends the past to have supported the schools with a great deal of enthusiasm. That doesn't mean that that well is bottomless either. You know that.
I just thought the conversation deserved that we're not stopping at the cost of inflation. There are people in the district who I would suspect would support spending more on education.
And see, that's that variable that you see around the state. Because you'll see some districts that will do exactly what you said. You tell us what you need and we'll figure out how to pay for it. I've seen that happen and you just go, that's scary, but because of their tax base, they,
I don't want to cast aspersions. I would argue that's what our legislature is.
yes.
Isn't this budget that you're going to prepare this fall going to include the first payment of the bond issue?
The first one with principal.
What kind of a number is that going to be?
The principal is, I think, $1,048,000. And then interest, I think, in the ballpark of $630,000.
And are you asking for a 0% increase in budget or a 3-point-something inflation sized increase in the budget, including $1.6 million of debt repayment, or is that debt repayment going to be held outside of your
I would like to
proposed
see
limitations?
0, period.
So you want to spend $1.6 million less on education in Hartford this coming year.
No, I mean,
To keep
that's
the budget
comes to the
zero.
point of, that it sounds disastrous. Okay, but what does that mean? Does it mean five psychologist positions that we have to be eliminated? Is it the fact that her management team feels that they are more important and they cut umpteen, which I know is not there, but thousands from the supply budget in order to offset that? I don't know. It's like Tom was so concerned about the Wright River School and whether it was gonna be overpopulated. And that's one of the reasons I asked about class sizes. Where is the Wright River School? Is it full? Do we have openings? Because as we start talking about budget dollars and potentially moving them from one school to another, that impacts what kids are in Wright River versus what kids are in Golden Brook, and do we have to start moving some around? And I haven't, that was a big issue a while ago, and then it just died. Do you know,
No.
Kevin, do you know?
To be perfectly honest, that's why we are taking this look with a consulting firm, you know, at how we distribute our students around the district. And we need the variable we don't have right now is the impact of the new construction that's coming online for the end of the school year. So those kids are coming, whether we're ready for them or not, they're gonna be here.
What new construction are you thinking is coming online?
Well, what we had the apartments, you know, on Prospect,
There's on Site Avenue.
there's more coming
Big
in
development out there.
on sites.
What else?
And there was another,
The guy from Twin Pines, I
Yeah.
believe,
yeah, Twin Farms.
said that there were 100.
Oh, yeah, you're on that.
Planning,
Yeah.
there's 40 units or so on Prospect Street.
Mhm.
They're all occupied at this point. So it wouldn't be too hard to figure out how many kids are in that building. I suspect there are very few, most of those apartments are one-bedroom apartments or studios, I think. The property on Sykes Avenue is 250 units in total, I believe. And it's the same thing there. I really pushed the developer's proposal, asking them to provide more larger apartments. There's no money in it for them. These are all gonna be one bedroom with a few, just a very, very few two-bedroom apartments in that whole development. So if you get a lot of kids out of that development, they're gonna be living in bunk beds in their family's living room.
Yeah.
Because the apartments aren't really set up
I mean, that might be the
for
reality
kids.
of the housing situation.
It might be, but the point I'm trying to make is, I'm not aware of any large scale development that's going on in town that's apt to bring dozens or hundreds of kids to the school that you're not aware of right now. The state's done a lot to push us to focus development on areas with water and sewer. That's what Peter was saying a minute ago. So there's gonna be some of that, but I suspect that's all gonna be small stuff. It's gonna be accessory dwelling units added in somebody's backyard for a mother-in-law or something, or maybe a small family. But it's gonna be one or two at a time. It's, you know, there're gonna be a few of those happening, but it's not gonna be of a size that it's gonna overwhelm you to provide education for kids showing up that you're not aware of. I don't.
But I think, you know, one of the concerns, you know, right now is that being said and taken into account in, you know, full consideration is the impact of where they're located, you know, because of the existing, let's say, catchment areas that we have. Dolphin Brook, draws from X part of town, out of Queechee, and then White River Elementary. And when you have any growth, in any one of those pockets that has the potential of expanding that, that bubble, and it's not the thinking in terms like we're gonna have hundreds of trees. It's more like when we're looking at those class size numbers that, we were talking about, and coming up with that formula, how do we adjust that? What's gonna work?
So you had a catchment study proposed as part of the spending on in this bond issue.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that I've heard anything suggesting that that's gonna be available in time to become part of the budget that's being prepared now. It strikes me that it's gonna take a long, long time to do a catchment study properly and then convince the community that the results of the catchment study are going to be acceptable to them. So it's unrealistic to think you're gonna do a catchment study between now and Christmas
No.
to impact budget decisions for this budget cycle. So I think you're living with what you've got. And just to finish the criticism, is that you had a couple of administrators attend this training that was just described to us in some detail, and it's pretty exciting stuff. But at the same time, the timing couldn't be worse, because you've got to come home with knowledge of new and better things that should be investigated to figure out how they apply to Hartford. At the same time that your finance guy has got to be scrambling to put a budget together in the next month and a half or so in order to meet deadlines that he can't move. So, I think you're really looking at using any of that information in the next cycle, next fall. And you probably should just stick to how you operate right now, if you're putting a budget together for this cycle, and not think about catchment changes or new ways to balance staff to students. It just doesn't seem practical. And if I can give one more thought, and that is, this board needs to do about 1,000,000% better job of communicating to the community what they're up to. And you're not gonna do that. So Doug was just saying, nobody's here to listen to us talk about the budget tonight. Did anybody get invited? You posted an agenda sometime Monday for a meeting Wednesday, and that's the first time anybody in the public had a clue that we were gonna talk about budgets. And who reads school board agendas? You've really got to spend a lot of time communicating to the public that there's any reason to spend any more than nothing on public school education. And until you do a better job of that, I'm not sure that anything more than what you're spending right now is gonna go over very big with the community. Much as I'd like to see robust spending for public education, I'm not very optimistic.
Well, that's part of what is going on simultaneously as well. And is trying to do a better job of that. We're still, working on the rollout of the newsletter and getting that out so that people will be able to see what we're doing, and have a better understanding of this timeline and the process. Because, that's pretty much set in stone. Those documents and budgets need to be prepared by January 20 or something, whatever that magic date is in January. And so coming back from that, all of the work, like you said, for this year, you know, we have to take the data that we got, you know, and that's built upon the enrollment data from October first. You know, and that's what we build, you know, that upcoming budget. But at the same time, we have to look to the future, you know, as well. And because nothing stays stagnant when kids are involved.
How is the catch, who sets the catchment? My understanding is the superintendent and in consultation with the school bus company sets the catchment.
No. No, but, you know, but.
That's what the previous superintendent told me, because I'm on the edge of the catchment.
Well, it's a factor, you know, it isn't, you know, set. You know, I mean, you know, a group is designed a certain way, you know, a bus route.
Yeah.
And it needs to be able to get from point A to point B to the schools that are impacted, you know? So that, you know, but that's the logistic that is a factor within the process, but it doesn't determine the catchment, because you need just one family to move into a house and they've got a full family, 5 kids, let's say, and they've got 5 kids and one goes, you know, 2 go to elementary school, 1's in junior high, and 2 are in high school. So now you're looking at that bus route, you know, and it's different, you know, and where does it intersect, you know? That's a fun one.
Who sets it? You? The superintendent, the townspeople, who sets the catchment?
Superintendent's office. The SOS, superintendent school. You know, works with it because he or she has the live information, you know? And that does change from time to time, when you've got those mitigating circumstances.
No, I mean, I live like right on the line,
Yeah.
and my neighbors' kids went to a different school, and the kids that are older than them went to the school that my kids go to. It seems to wiggle every year.
Well, like you said, that's a weird line. It doesn't have as much structure.
Heard it's as much an art, or more of an art than it is a science. Yeah, it really is.
Gerrymandering.
When you got 60 kids behind you, when you're driving that, you know. Anyways, you know, thanks for the conversation, and, you know, we are working, you know, on that. Yes. Just to, add to the conversation, as you've probably seen in the news, there's been a lot of activity from the legislature and the administration, you know, around, you know, ed finance. And how that how do we get away from what happened last year? And it was projected, you know, that it was gonna happen. And part of the reason for that extra piece of, information that we put, you know, into the packet. Education finance in Vermont, even when we hire consultants, they scratch their heads sometimes at the beginning. Because it's different. And it has been different, you know, as long as I can remember. And so I guess if you have a moment, and I don't. Oh, actually, we've got a little bit of time, so. If you go to your packet, there's a section, I reached out to, Julia. She's the one who developed this presentation. And we can get it, as a link for you as well. So if you want to see the original slides. She did a really good job around explaining how ed finance actually works in Vermont. And it gives us a history as well. And how school district spending is determined locally, you know, and the work that the legislature does. And then the effect that Brigham has had, you know, in 97 on all of us. You know, and basically it said every school will provide an equal opportunity for all of their students. You know, and so there were districts that were spending, I mean, it's hard to even equate, you know, with some of the numbers. If you look at some of the per pupil spending. You know, we're at about 14. What were we last year? Whereas the high was 20. Yeah. So when you look at that variability, you know something in the system is gonna be squeezed. Because at the end of the day, we all pay for all of that. Well, so we're not just paying for Hartford, we're paying a piece of that. 20.
We're paying to a pot out of the
Just, how much does Hartford, for example, Hartford School District put in the pot versus how much we get back?
Well, that's what our per pupil spending says, right?
I was gonna say, Peter, I'm thinking of the slide that we had last year where, we sent a lot of money up to the state and I don't think we got proportionally as much.
We danced over the line, I don't remember the numbers. Exactly where we are. I believe that last year we were a net sending town, instead of a receiving town.
We were.
And, it's varied a little bit. As was noted earlier in the conversation, we're growing, therefore there's demand for housing, which results in a market where there's scarcity, increased prices of houses, which means that our valuations are higher, and therefore we put in a larger portion of the pot.
Have we ever been a receiving town?
I believe that we have been in recent history. I don't have the numbers memorized or anything, but my memory is that there have been occasions where we were a net receiving. We've never been seriously either way.
What's the percentage, like what's the disparity versus? how much we pay and how much
I
we-
cannot answer that. I'm sure that with a little bit of time, you could come up with the answer for it, Jacob, but I don't know the answer. We've tended to float, if my memory is correct, and it may or may not be, around just above or just below in terms of net receiving, because we've never been terribly extravagant, but we also have not cheaped out. And we are one of the larger communities with the potential, and the real estate market in this town has fluctuated so much, so rapidly, that you can go from, it's driven more by that than anything else. A couple of years ago, my house was underwater significantly, even though we had paid off most of the mortgage, because literally no houses had sold at all, and the banks were therefore willing to say you're worth anything. And then now we're supposedly well above water. I can tell you, we haven't paid off that much more of the mortgage in the 2 years or 3 years to make a difference. So it really depends on real estate valuations more than anything else, and our real estate valuations in comparison to the rest of the state. Traditionally, places like Killington and Stowe have been quote gold towns. They were sending much more than we did, or than most towns did, because they had a lot of investment in heavier infrastructure around the ski industry, and a lot of very expensive second homes and things like that, and therefore they would send a lot more money. We've had less of that kind of thing here. COVID played interesting things to our demographics. A lot of people ended up moving here to get away from the big cities and the scares, and when they got here, they decided they liked it. It's just nice. But at the same time, if you're living in your house and you haven't gotten a raise in a couple of years and everything else, and the cost of living has gone up, and your house is just doubled in value, paying a twice as high tax is not an easy thing to swallow.
And what's interesting, everything Peter just mentioned is part of that slide on number 4. It talks about the brief history of education finance, because it details what that looked like. You know,
Probably just get to it so people can see the presentation.
you know, but, you know, did we vote this slide for that one?
I did include it in the folder.
Yes.
We weren't.
So it was a extra accessory.
Oh, I see.
It was an accessory, you know, piece, you know, but there's a lot of information about the process. And just to explain, the Joint Fiscal Office is a nonpartisan entity of the legislature. And they're the ones that developed, you know, that presentation. And it's well worth, you know, like taking, you know, the time to, you know, to look at, because it gives you that background information about how we got to where we are. And it also poses the question, what are we doing now that we're here? And that's what that commission is supposed to come back with answers for the legislature in January. So I guess that's, you know, that's it. We can probably, as we move forward, you know, we could look at, you know, doing more of the dive into that if people are interested. But we'll keep moving forward. Yes.
Isn't there a committee of the legislature that's just started working on education reform or funding reform?
And it started in July. Because it was enacted, it's part of the legislative process that finished up. And so it's made up of the money committees and the 2 education committees, and then the agency. And then there's also members from the associations represented on the committee as well.
So are they taking testimony from local school boards and public?
Oh, yeah.
So have any of you testified before this committee?
we've asked questions. You know, not,
How do you ask questions?
you could submit, you know, you could submit questions, you know, at
To
the
the committee.
hearings, right? You know, one of the big concerns, you know, that we had, you know, coming up as an immediate problem is the change of you know, the finance director, at the Agency of Education. And so we reached out from here to the Speaker of the House and to the Governor's office directly with a request to make sure that we have somebody in place to support not just our business manager, but those other 60 or so business managers across the state.
If I haven't heard any discussion at the board table to do with this committee or you communicating the district's position to the committee in that way, how, you just said we have communicated or we've submitted questions. Who's the we? Does that mean you've been in communication with the committee or
Yeah,
the superintendent or?
You know, I've been in communication with them directly, just because I have focused my work around education directly for a good amount of time.
Shouldn't this board have on its agenda regularly a discussion of the impact of what's going on at the state level for education funding or requirements for education? That you could then be responding to committees that are working on education issues at the state. So that what's communicated is the board's position, not an individual board member's position.
Well, some of our discussions do lead into that we don't have, let's say, a fixed, you know, topic section, you know, on that. That's not a bad idea, especially now with what's going on.
I know in my previous life, probably sick of hearing about my Wisconsin time, but I served on the State School Boards Association as I was a director, a region director, and I also brought back to my local school board what was going on at the School Boards Association and what was happening in the legislature, and we had regular discussions at the board table about what positions I should take to communicate when I testified before a legislative finance committee or the joint education committee, or when the School Boards Association was planning their lobbying efforts. What was I supposed to communicate to them on behalf of my local school board? So it seems like that would be an important conversation for you to be having at the board table. And that's the kind of thing that people in the community might pick up on, that you're actively working on influencing education finance reform in the state. Certainly needs a lot of attention. I guess I'd encourage you to put stuff on the agenda so you could be having these discussions in public and taking group positions on things to communicate up to the state.
If you are interested, there is a listen and learn tour that is being conducted by the Department of the Agency of Education, that is going on now. And the intention is to listen in one of those sessions. They have both in person and, Zoom conference kinds of things that are happening.
So again, how do mere mortals sitting at home wondering whether they're gonna watch, news on the presidential election or focus on the school board or play a game on the computer? How do they decide that there's something going on in school funding, school finance, or just education in general that they should pay attention to? Are you helping us
Again,
know what's going on?
right, again, that's, part of the hope of moving forward with this, new newsletter piece is to be able to get that out. We get weekly updates, from the Vermont School Boards Association. So every member of the board, gets that. Our representative on the association is Nancy. And she serves in that role. And so all of that information about those activities that are going on is listed there. And so we should, take, a section of the meeting to talk about what's going on, at the state level, because it's there,
You can share that weekly update.
That,
I'm not criticizing you as a board so much as the entire process in this state. There's just very little communication as to what the legislature is up to that reaches the general public. You're getting information from your state association. You're not passing it along to us. The association doesn't want to talk to just mere mortals out in the public. You gotta be a school board member to have anything to do with them. They don't put a lot on their public facing website that really amounts to much. And that's something else you probably should encourage the School Boards Association to do, which is to communicate statewide on what's going on in the legislature and how local citizens can influence that process.
well, I think that's an easy, let's say, add, to our discussions, because it is that simple.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay,
Kevin,
yes,
can I put my PR hat on for a moment?
sure.
He raised a good issue. Who controls the flashing board at the front of the high school? Do you, Jonathan?
No,
That's the high school.
Why can't we post the agenda for the school board meeting and light it up so that both sides, so people know 2 days in advance? Just one more means in which to communicate. But I don't know who controls the switch.
We can certainly post that there is a meeting. I don't think we could put the agenda on there.
You're gonna have people crashing.
I could see somebody, going over the curve.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting.
I was wondering where that meeting
There's nothing stopping you folks from, getting people on a mailing list and sending emails out with your board agendas or with stuff that's going on at the state level that they might be interested in. When you go to town meeting this spring, you're gonna get, it's gonna be a pretty adversarial process, I suspect. And the more you do between now and then to communicate what you're up to, I think is gonna work to your benefit.
Well taken.
And Jonathan, I have one other question. I just read where all the clerical staff are going to apply to for the union. Has there been any discussion amongst the clerical staff at the superintendent's office?
I'm not sure.
I mean, I was shocked when I saw it, but I thought, well, they're just down the hill from us.
Another piece to the vote. Okay. That brings us to public comment.
No, the superintendent's there.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. So would you fill us in on that point of contact?
Yep, I can talk to about the point of contact piece. So our district social worker, Carrie Russell, has volunteered to be the point of contact for the superintendent search. We brought that topic to the administrative council and sought input, and Carrie volunteered her time to be that liaison.
But, so she'll be working with the consulting firm, to help put together the committee, the search committee. And we had put that outline of the committee out several times, and hope that before, we start that part of the process, they'll be in contact, with the entities, because there's obviously the teachers union, the administrators, the support staff, like community members, they'll be reaching out to those specific groups, but we'll repost the structure of that committee. Now that we've got the point of contact today.
And do we have a timeline for when these next steps are gonna happen?
And now that that's in place, we can set the calendar.
Not yet, to be determined.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we can do public.
No one, land with our candidates currently.
How many attendees are there?
There are 3 attendees.
Any of you folks like to share something?
Where is that posted about committees? Well, so, superintendent search committee, like where is that out, where is that posted?
Oh, it's been part of the minutes several times. We've entered it into the minutes, a number of times that we've had the discussion. We needed to, the next step that the firm that we were working with needed was that point of contact person to assist them with developing the rest of the timeline. We're putting that in place. So, we can make sure that that's posted, like on, on the webpage, what the committee structure is, because we did vote in public what that's gonna look like. Because when we did the last superintendent search, we had like 20 plus people, and as you can imagine, trying to coordinate, all of the activities that you need to get through with that big a group. I think this one is like that 12 to 14.
Larger than I wanted. Yeah. I was a proponent of a smaller, group because it could move faster.
We'll make sure that gets uploaded if it's already up.
I thought it was. Yeah, I thought it was.
If not, we'll put it up there.
It's not easily findable, so.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings me to my next point about it. I attended most of the meetings since the school year started, this one. And it seems like every time there's a comment around the website, around who's controlling signage, public relations, et cetera, how do we get out communications? I think it's fairly apparent to me that needs to be a position within the district. I would strongly encourage the board to incorporate that in their budget.
Well, one of the things that, we've been in looking at the next meeting agenda, there's already been, you know, a request, you know, to put those topics on the agenda. So we'll have a very forward-facing discussion about it, you know, being the website, you know, the new newsletter, et cetera, you know, would be part of that discussion.
Talk a little bit about that now, if you'd like. So I mean, big shout out to Katie. She did put out the first district newsletter on October. What was the date? The first Friday of October? I don't remember what date it was. Next one's gonna go out on November 8th. It continues to take on more content. It went out through Infinite Campus to all employees, teachers and students. It got posted on the Hartford listserv. It got put on, the school board's, Facebook page, and I believe a link got posted on the board's website as well, or the board webpage as well. Now, on the website, I totally understand your pain points. As a new board member, it was tough for me to find just about anything on there. So one of the things I'd like to include maybe in the December newsletter, maybe we can all talk about that more at the next meeting, would be a usability study. It would basically be asking everybody in the community for feedback about the website. So there would be some tasks in there specific to the website, like find the meeting minutes for the last board meeting. Rate how easy or not that was. Give us all the feedback that you want. And the idea would be, you know, instead of a bunch of conversations about it, we could get a bunch of, you know, tangible data. But then once we put together an RFP at some point in the future for a website revamp, we'd be able to hand all this information to a development team. Say, these are the current pain points of the website. So that's.
Or
We'll
a
talk more about
district
that at the
employee
next
that
meeting.
incorporated that as part of their duties
Right.
among other communication duties.
I'm completely with you that I think somebody in-house in the district, it makes sense to have a full-time communication person. So I'm definitely with you there. But I want to talk more
But you
about.
need the data.
at The next meeting as well, so.
And data's king. Information, I should say, is king, or queen.
I'll just interject here and tell you, since you brought it up, how far it goes. I was talking to somebody in Tennessee this morning, and the first thing out of her mouth was how wonderful it was to see the superintendent's weekly communication, and proceeded to tell me almost verbatim, word for word, what she'd read. So people are looking, people want to know, and I told her, "We'll wait till next month." Eddie will be on again.
Where is that? Do you have a newsletter that on this website somewhere? Gary, you just said you thought the district newsletter, that's not what you're talking about, I guess.
It's Katie, what we're developing.
Is it the
The
same
monthly
document?
district newsletter, the first one went out.
That's
So
not,
first-
that's not on
first week of October.
the Board of Education page.
It's on the homepage of the district website. There's a heading right underneath, welcome to the Hartford School District. Check out the first edition of the new HSD district newsletter.
Okay.
Click on there and it'll bring you right to the newsletter.
And I've just demonstrated what's wrong with websites in general.
We'll see.
I don't land on the homepage. Doesn't do much for me. I'm going to the school board page, and so I've got to be retrained to look at other stuff, or you've got to put links on the multiple pages for things that you're trying to get out from the public.
Well, so I agree with you on both. You get into trouble sometimes by putting multiple links on pages, because then you can get lost, but I'm 100% with you on the being consistent and having it be in those locations, like it's on the homepage of the district site. It ends up on the Facebook page. It ends up in the listserv, and those are the places that you can consistently look.
And I probably saw it on the listserv. That's probably where I got to it.
Cool.
But every time you post something, you've got to be thinking listserv, Facebook, Twitter, the district website. How many people am I still missing in town that don't partake of any of that nonsense? So, you know, there are
Other tools.
The electronic bulletin board out at the street may be your best hope for a few people, but
Being able to sign up for text alerts.
yes.
Well, and I like the idea of being able to create an email list as well. I know that we talked about it. I don't think that Infinite Campus can do that for non-staff students or parents, but doesn't mean that there's not another tool that we could look into.
The town, on the town's website, I think they've had it forever, but it hasn't been publicized, but with their new public relations guy, it's come to the light that you can sign up for like 20 and 30 different types of information from the town that they'll push out whenever something comes up. So,
Comes right to you.
yeah, so I think that's really what you're gonna do is create an opt-in situation where people know that there's a place to go to online where they can sign up for the Dothan Brook Web's newsletter and the high school newsletter. They don't care about the middle school because they don't have a kid there right now. They might want to see school board activities, so they're gonna check that box, but they might get half a dozen or more different pieces of information whenever it, and they don't have to go looking for it. It's gonna land in their mailbox.
I gotcha.
They've signed up a couple of different things in the town. You know, they just automatically come to the community reports and stuff.
But we'll have to reach out to the town and see what they're using, and if we can do that, or something similar.
I think what they're using is part of the service they buy for their whole website. So it's probably not what you want to get into. But there are other products out there that do that for you. They're pretty cheap, probably free.
They also have a part-time PR person.
Right, that's what I'm saying. With that new PR person, things are getting quite a bit better. They've always had all these newsletters, but nobody ever knew about it.
Well, point taken for trying
We
to.
need a communication specialist.
Yeah.
That designs the website, that maintains the website, that blasts on all this social media, that has access to the sign, and they're wearing all those hats, and everyone's funneling information to them, and that's their sole responsibility is communication. Because you lose things when you put it on, you know, multiple people to, hey, don't forget to post this or send it here.
All right, well, if there's no other hands. Cool. I guess we'll, move into the consent agenda. Looks like there's a single appointment.
Amy Hall, Dothan Brook School, Special Education.
No resignations or retirements.
Meeting minutes from 10/9/2024. Any edits or amendments to the meetings?
So could I just comment on that, please?
Yes.
The first time that they were shared on the website, I had a parentheses in part of Mr. Merrill's second motion relating to the retroactive consent. And then I did correct it after I watched the jam recording, and just to make sure that Jacob made sure that in the packet tonight is the formal full set of minutes, and also listed in the October 9th folder is the full set of minutes. So if you're referring to one that has the parentheses, that's really the first draft, and there is a second draft that you'll be voting on tonight. Thank you.
Great.
Move that we approve the consent agenda. With our welcome to the newest member of our community.
Second.
No further discussion, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? So moved. And the next meeting is November 13th. And meeting evaluation.
Because on you to do it, John?
Back to the thing. Board, number one, board was prepared for meeting, satisfactory. Board's time has been on ends, not means, is satisfactory. Each board member was given the opportunity to participate, say satisfactory. Board treated all persons with courtesy and fairness, satisfactory. Board adhered to Robert's Rules of Order, satisfactory. Board adhered to its adopted government style, satisfactory.
Move that we adjourn.
Non-debatable motion.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye. Thank you for doing that.